Hi, welcome, and thank you for joining our presentation this evening on ketogenic adaptations for endurance athletes. My name is Paul Takac, and I'm a Master of Science student at the Maryland University of Integrative Health. Uh, Introduce myself a little bit here. I am an Ironman athlete. Those that know me are sometimes surprised to hear that, but I have completed 4 Ironmans. I'm in my early 50s, and I've been competing in running races, including marathons, for about 25 years. I'm also a hockey player in the past and played a lot of different sports. But once I got into doing triathlons in my middle years, I became very interested in it, and like many of you, started tracking my performance. It was actually out of that interest that my fascination with nutrition as a really critical element of endurance racing emerged. And this topic of ketogenic diets in particular prompted me to want to return to school and study it in a bit more depth so that I could begin to not only understand it better for myself, but hopefully to help explain it to others. So this is certainly a personal passion of mine, and I certainly hope to begin to work with folks to help them maximize their potential and as well as their overall wellness. So let's go ahead and get started. The first question is, when I say ketogenic, what does that mean? Really, it just means the generation or the genesis of ketones, which is an alternative energy source for the body. In order to understand the implications of this and what it means, it's helpful to delve briefly into a little bit of physiology and biochemistry, although I'll attempt to make it as painless and straightforward as possible. Who knows, maybe you'll end up being as fascinated as I am by all of it. So there are two ways that the body can produce energy, by using carbohydrates or by using ketones. The former energy source is typically derived directly from the diet, whereas the latter is normally fueled by stored body fat. As we'll soon see, however, this is not always the case, and there are some exceptions. In order to understand where ketones come from, it's important to first understand how the body uses carbohydrates. So let's go ahead and take a closer look. Here's what happens when you ingest carbs. There's an awful lot of detail and complexity that I'm leaving out here, but this is the big picture. Carbohydrates themselves are ingested in the form of glucose. Glucose can occur singly or in short chains. These are often referred to as the various sugars, monosaccharides, disaccharides, or polysaccharides. Longer, more complex polysaccharide chains are actually called starches, so sugars and starches. Digestion breaks all of these down into one or two glucose molecules, which are absorbed in the small intestine and then enter the bloodstream where they become available to cells. Glucose is the raw material that mitochondria and cells use to make energy in the form of ATP or adenosine triphosphate in a process known as glycolysis. However, the glucose needs some way to get into the cells. Fortunately, the presence of glucose in the blood triggers a host of hormonal responses from the endocrine system, including the release of insulin, which is produced in the pancreas, and the suppression of other hormones such as glucagon at the same time. Insulin is actually glucose's ticket into the cell via special receptors called GLUT transporters, all of which there are several types, depending on the type of cell, the form of glucose, etc. However, if the cells already have enough glucose and ATP, a small amount of extra can be stored in the form of glycogen in most cells, including skeletal muscle and in the liver. Another problem that can arise is when the cells are overstimulated by chronically high levels of glucose and insulin. In this case, the cells become insulin resistant, in which case they need the glucose, but the transporters become less and less efficient over time. In either case, excess glucose remains in the bloodstream, can't be absorbed into the cells, and eventually ends up in the liver, where hepatocytes, which is the name for liver cells, bundles up all that excess glucose as fatty acids and links them together in various lipid or fat packages called triglycerides, cholesterol, and various lipoproteins such as LDL, HDL, and others. This process is lipogenesis, or the generation of lipids. And these are endogenous lipids that are made in the liver. These are then released back into the bloodstream in bundles which are called chylomicrons. And if they're not used by other cells at that point, eventually end up being deposited into new or existing fat cells, which are also known as adipose tissue. As we'll see, adipose tissue evolved to be temporary storage, so that in times of need, they could release free fatty acids back into the system, where they could return to the liver and be converted into ketones in a process called lipolysis, which, as we'll see on the next slide, most cells can use as an alternative fuel source, those ketones. Exceptions include red blood cells and some areas of the brain, but as we'll see later, the body can also generate a limited supply of its own glucose via a process called gluconeogenesis, the generation of new glucose. Returning to this graphic, in other words, that was meant to be a two-way street, but unfortunately has all too often in our modern world become a one-way street because insulin naturally inhibits lipolysis. Um, Once those ketones are released, they can go back into the cells, but unless that actually happens, it's kind of a challenge. I'm somebody who really likes analogies to help understand this, and sometimes the way I think about this whole process is like a school. At the beginning of the day, buses show up. Maybe that's your breakfast. Think of the buses as your meal, and the students are all released and get into the hallways, and that's glucose entering your bloodstream. But unless they can get into the classrooms, they're kind of just wandering the halls. And over time, the keys to the doors become worn out, and that's insulin resistance. As more and more students are wandering the halls, eventually a teacher or principal or somebody comes out and grabs them and maybe puts them all into the library, and that becomes the storage area, and they're all sitting at tables, and until things clear out and those pathways open up, they're really kind of stuck there. So if that's a useful analogy, certainly that's something that you could build on if you're interested in those kind of things. But I definitely sort of see this visually, and hope you do as well. It's fairly straightforward at a basic level. As I mentioned, over time, overstimulation of the pancreas can lead to a lowered insulin production and that insulin resistance that I mentioned. Um, that can lead to increased adipose tissue, which are two of the components that can lead to metabolic syndrome, which can eventually develop into type 2 diabetes, um, which is a risk factor, and comorbidity along with cardiovascular disease, stroke, and so much more. So it really begins this chain reaction, this chronic um, overstimulation and chronic um, uh, high insulin levels in the blood. And that can become a real problem, even for athletes, which tend to ingest an awful lot of sugar, even though we're exercising a lot of it. Um, this overconsumption of carbohydrates has really contributed to the skyrocketing rates of obesity and metabolic diseases that we have today. This chart shows the correlation between increasing carb intake and obesity rates in the US in the 40 years from 1960 to about 2000. You can see it really began to accelerate in about the 1980s. This graphic shows an even longer time horizon of sugar consumption tied to obesity in both the United Kingdom and then the US over the last 300 years. Interestingly, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, and others began really a huge push in dietary recommendations to lower the consumption of dietary fat, especially saturated fats. But look at the obesity rates beginning in that time. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimate that last year, that's 2016, over 1 in 3 adult Americans was obese, over 36%. And the rate's over 70% if you include those who are classified as overweight. That is almost 3 out of every 4 adults in the US um, is overweight or obese. And the rate among children, even very young children, is skyrocketing as well. So the question is why? Um, is it that we didn't heed those recommendations? Is that why obesity rates have soared? Not exactly. At the same time the consumption of saturated animal fats declined, the proportion of our diet that included highly processed foods, that include high amounts of both sugar and refined carbohydrates, as well as polyunsaturated fatty acids, that's on the right-hand side there, PUFAs. Um, while many such correlations with obesity can be made, the shift from naturally occurring fats, including saturated and monounsaturated fats, to artificial fats, hydrogenated, polyunsaturated fats, is clearly a contributing factor and something that must be considered later when we talk about low carb, high fat dietary approaches. We really have to keep in mind that all fats are not created equal. Um, this shift from a carbohydrate-based diet to a ketogenic diet that we're going to talk about also emphasizes these healthy fats. It's safe and highly effective for weight loss and a host of other medical conditions. But before we get into that in too much detail, let's first return for a moment to the energetic pathways and consider just a few more issues. We've already discussed glucose, but we've not really differentiated between the various types of ketones. Uh, for present purposes, we can consider acetoacetate, or ACA, to be the precursor of a more bioactive form known as beta-hydroxybutyrate, um, or sometimes simply BHB. After being generated in the hepatocytes, beta-hydroxybutyrate is released into the bloodstream and can be preferentially used by cells to generate energy when glucose is scarce or absent. Now let's consider for a moment energy storage. Most estimates of glycogen storage suggest a mean value of around 2,500 calories or kilocalories. Uh, we commonly talk about calories, but they're in actuality kilocalories. Um, of course, people with more muscle can obviously store a bit more, although they would also tend to need to tap into those reserves more as well. The value for energy storage potential in adipose tissue, on the other hand, is much greater. Here it's shown for a person with approximately 12% body fat, which is really not a lot. Even the most lean individuals, say 7% body fat, has approximately 30,000 kilocalories available, which is an order of magnitude greater than glycogen. Um, Normal-sized individuals, somebody who we would think of as relatively uh, normal, I guess is the best word, can easily have over 100,000 kilocalories stored in fat. Um, it's also worth remembering here that fat is more energy dense per gram than either glucose or protein. It has about 9 kilocalories per gram versus 4 kilocalories for both glucose and protein. Thus, it's more efficient in terms of generating ATP per unit of oxygen consumed. Um, Talking about oxygen, as any athlete who gets winded or short of breath will attest, generating energy and using muscles when oxygen is scarce generates a lot of lactic acid. In fact, that anaerobic glycolysis is also much less efficient at generating ATP as it occurs outside the mitochondria and the cytosol of the cell. Um, Another thing that's worth mentioning here too is that energy production using ketone substrates actually produces fewer reactive oxygen species and free radicals and those sorts of potentially damaging molecules in the mitochondria than does glucose. This reduces oxidative stress and presumably preserves antioxidant reserves for other purposes in exercising cells and muscles. The result is much less inflammation and enhanced recovery, as we'll see. Let's return for a moment to these energetic pathways and consider just a couple more items. Um, I think a useful analogy here is to think of building a fire with sticks versus logs. Sticks are really the glucose or the glycogen. It burns fast, doesn't last very long, produces a lot of smoke, but flames out pretty quickly. Um, with the log, it takes a bit longer to get started. In this case, the period of adaptation, shifting from a typically carb-based diet, as we'll see. But once the fire starts burning, it really yields a lot more heat and less byproduct. Um, Finally, I should mention that this is a really highly simplified overview, and at each step, much is going on physiologically, biochemically, hormonally, which influences and regulates these really intricately linked pathways. There are key vitamins, minerals, enzymes, such as B vitamins, magnesium, and a whole lot other um, components that are required. But hopefully this serves as a good intro overview. Another thing to consider here is that I mentioned there is this process by which um, amino acids or protein components can actually be generated in the body into glucose from non-glucose starters. So that process is called gluconeogenesis, and is something that people who are becoming adapted to a ketogenic diet sometimes are on the lookout for. They don't want to actually generate glucose when they're not ingesting it. So that's something that also plays an important evolutionary role, and is something we'll return to a little bit later on as well. Just a quick note on the safety. You may have heard of a term called ketoacidosis. You might think you've heard it's dangerous, it's potentially deadly. This is actually an excellent question, and one has a relatively simple answer. Nutritional ketosis can never concentrate blood ketone levels to the same dangerous degree, which can occur in uncontrolled type 1 diabetes, which is really the complete absence or ability to synthesize insulin. If you're looking at blood ketone levels as an example, they're typically in people that regularly consume carbohydrates, they're typically in the range of 0.1 millimoles per liter or less. Those following a strict low-carb diet, on the other hand, can have levels that begin at just over zero point 0.5 and typically plateau, even under really severe carb restriction and activity levels, at only a few millimoles per liter. This is the range of nutritional ketosis. While there is significant individual variability in terms of the adaptation time needed to achieve these levels, on average, daily restriction of total carbs to between, say, 20 and 50 grams for a period of 10 days to 2 weeks is usually sufficient, although for some people it can take as long as even 2 to 3 months. Ketoacidosis, on the other hand, is a really dangerous increase in blood acidity or pH due to runaway ketone production and this is the key, elevated blood glucose levels at the same time. This requires immediate medical intervention. Type 1 diabetics, I should mention, should never attempt to induce any type of nutritional ketosis unless under the orders and close supervision of their doctor. This is really for folks who can tolerate it. The rest of us, however, can rest assured you cannot self-induce ketoacidosis. Your body's natural regulatory system will simply prevent it. Finally, I should mention some pioneering work in the late 1960s and 70s by Dr. George Cahill and others, which documented the body's reaction to starvation. This really helped elucidate not only the pathways by which ketones could be oxidized and used as fuel, but also the mechanisms by which specific amino acid substrates could be converted to glucose via the gluconeogenesis we just talked about. They also showed that while the brain typically relies on glucose, it can shift to preferential use of ketones when needed. In fact, the common misconception that the brain needs glucose is a bit overstated. People in significant ketosis can tolerate extraordinary levels, low levels of hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. This has obvious implications for the idea that for athletes, a lack of glucose is what causes some athletes to bonk or hit the wall. That may happen, but if they're keto adapted, it's almost certainly not due to low blood sugar. And besides gluconeogenesis, can also provide emergency reserves of glucose for red blood cells and other tissues that can't use those ketones. All is needed is the amino acids from the diet, or actually from your own muscle breaking down catabolically as well. One final note before moving on. Despite considerable concern about the possible negative effects of increased protein intake on the kidney or renal system and function, there really is limited evidence for any adverse effect in those with otherwise healthy kidneys, and may indeed actually be improvements in renal function as well. So, to summarize then, what are the advantages of a ketogenic eating pattern or a low carb, high fat approach, sometimes used interchangeably? First, by keeping insulin levels in check, a ketogenic diet can help reestablish insulin sensitivity and begin to reverse those devastating cascade of physiological processes that lead to metabolic syndrome and associated chronic diseases. Um, Second, lower level insulin levels allow for the natural process of lipolysis, which frees stored energy in adipose tissue and provides the necessary precursors for tapping into those reserves when needed by the body. And some people say it upregulates the metabolic pathway. Also, as we'll see in more detail in the following section, experimental and observational data strongly suggests the metabolism of ketones results in a lower production of reactive oxygen species and other inflammatory processes. This protects cellular structure and function. There's also evidence to suggest that the oxidation of ketones, like those burning logs I described a moment ago, has a regulatory effect on inflammation and even is a signaling molecule for specific activator genes. Taken together, this helps reduce oxidative stress and really helps speed recovery as well. That may, in fact, be one of the primary basis of the neuroprotective benefits of a ketogenic diet, which we'll see for those with epilepsy and other degenerative neurological disorders. Finally, and perhaps most counterintuitively, at least given our current beliefs about the benefits of low-fat eating, a diet high in ingested lipids but low in carbohydrates has consistently shown a correlation with reduced triglyceride levels in the blood. And while overall cholesterol and lipoprotein levels may increase, the ratio of good HDL cholesterol to bad LDL and VLDL cholesterol actually improves. In addition, changes in hormones such as ghrelin and leptin consistently show a pattern of reduced hunger and increased satiety, which typically leads to an overall reduction in ingested calories, but without that hunger and a feeling of deprivation. All of this leads really to both therapeutic medical benefits and an enhancement of athletic performance, particularly for endurance athletes. Um, in other words, it all seems positive, but yet there really does remain some significant debate and resistance to this point of view. But as we'll see, this may be the result more of the success of the low-fat dogma of the last 50 years, which in retrospect was based on incomplete and biased information rather than any type of new information or discovery. That's not to say that there do not remain detractors or skeptics, but it may surprise you to know that this is not as clear cut as we've been led to believe by government agencies and especially the modern food industry. In fact, as we'll see next, one could say, well, what was old is now new again. So let's take a first look at the medical applications and benefits. So, what can we say about the origins of the ketogenic diet or that low carb, high fat approach? Um, Really, it's important to bear in mind that only recently in human history have people enjoyed regular year round access to abundant dietary sources of carbohydrates. The shift to agriculture and sedentary way of life really began only about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. And this really began that shift to a more starch and grain based year round eating pattern. In fact, observations of modern hunter gatherers, or at least those that are not reliant on farming for subsistence, often live in what we would consider marginal environments with only periodic access to carb rich foods. In fact, not only did native groups such as the Maasai in Africa, the Eskimo in the Arctic, Native Americans on the Great Plains, they really existed primarily on animal products, high fat meat, and even dairy, and they really thrived. Is documented by many, including Dr. Weston Price, a dentist whose foundation continues to promote the importance of natural fats and fat soluble vitamins. Those native peoples were often more robust, taller, and healthier than their counterparts, even their own descendants, who adopted a more carbohydrate rich diet, especially if those were refined or processed. Um, the result, as we've seen, is really this highly developed capacity for the human body to adapt to diverse dietary inputs. And given the essential amino acids and fats, really can produce um, itself what otherwise it can't obtain from the environment. So it's really a very finely tuned system. I also want to take just a minute to talk a bit about a man named William Banting. Not Frederick Banting. He actually won the Nobel Prize in 1923 as a co-discoverer of insulin. And there's a lecture named after him by the American Diabetes Association and others. But I don't want to talk about Frederick. I want to talk about William for a moment. William Banting was actually an undertaker in London in the mid 19th century, and he happened to be sick and obese. But after consulting with his physician, who advised him to eliminate carbohydrates from his diet, he lost a significant amount of weight. But he didn't stop there. He then authored a small booklet titled Letter on Corpulence Addressed to the Public in 1863. Um, it could be considered the first really popular diet craze and diet book. It was really widely adopted. In fact, it wasn't until the low fat hypothesis was introduced and popularized almost 100 years later um, that Banting's ideas that it was really bread and potatoes that caused obesity was widely accepted and commonly accepted. Nothing I've said so far would surprise our great grandparents. Um, Strict ketogenic diets, however, didn't really surface until the 1920s when they were introduced as a therapy for uncontrolled epilepsy, particularly in children, an approach which remains a frontline treatment today and can, in many cases, completely eliminate the need for medication. In fact, is documented in an exhaustive edited volume of over 40 papers that was just published couple of months ago at the end of 2016. Ketogenic diets are now being investigated for an almost dizzying array, ever expanding array of medical conditions. These include, in addition to epilepsy, other neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's disease, neurodegenerative conditions like ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's, autism spectrum disorders, multiple sclerosis, other autoimmune processes, depression, migraines, mood disorders, even the regeneration of neural tissues that have been damaged by injury or accident. Um, One of the common observations of people who adopt a ketogenic diet is they sometimes feel more alert or more aware, even when they're tired. Which also, by the way, seems to occur less frequently. But These kind of neuroprotective effects could have profound implications for endurance athletes, particularly late in a race when fuzzy thinking or poor decision making can, and for many of us has, torpedoed our best laid plans, with often disastrous results. Um, but ketogenic diets aren't just for neurological disorder issues. They're also being investigated for metabolic disorders, as we talked about, diabetes, obesity, but also things like acne, aging, cancer, reproductive and endocrine disorders, even pain management. It's clearly an area to keep on in the future, keep an eye on. So there's far too much research to cover in any detail in the time we have here, but let's take a look at some specific research and particularly meta-analyses, that is, studies that summarize the findings of a large number of other individual studies. Um, let's start with weight loss. A relatively recent but comprehensive meta-analysis of 13 different randomized control studies, which are in fact the gold standard of clinical scientific research, compared those on a very low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, VLCKD. Um, those are defined as no more than 50 grams of carbs per day, to those on a low fat diet with less than 30% of total daily calories from fat. What they found was that the low carb subjects had statistically significant greater decreases in body weight, serum triglycerides, diastolic blood pressure, and greater increases in both HDL and LDL cholesterol. More recent studies published in medical journals consistently show the same pattern and often specifically call out the improved lipid profiles that I mentioned. Nevertheless, commonly accepted views are not so easily dismissed. Uh, as many nutritionists and medical professionals have pointed out, the dietary recommendations that we are all most familiar with, codified, for example, in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans as recently as 2010, are actually based on evidence that is often weak, fragmented, or even contradictory. Adele Height and her colleagues recently summed up this as, quote, strong recommendations, weak evidence, unquote. Um, this point is also made exhaustively in many of the more popular books referenced at the end of this talk. In fact, this topic has in many cases been best explored by journalists with a really keen eye for detail, storytelling, and a real independence born of not having a particular axe to grind or a dog in the fight, if you will, in this subject. An increasing number of researchers and clinicians are really beginning to come to the conclusion that while goals like reducing saturated fat are indisputably important for those on a high carbohydrate diet, we might really begin to shift the paradigm and shift the macronutrient content changes and how that changes the metabolic profile and can improve insulin control, lipid profiles, and reduce cardiovascular risks. It really is a whole new world of research that has been opened up. Another aspect of this that's repeatedly referred to in the literature is patient preference for and satisfaction with a low carb and high fat or high protein approach versus the really prevailing low fat recommendations. A meta review by Hessian and colleagues looking specifically at obesity found that low carb approaches were more effective than low fat diets in modifying risk factors, but also that the benefits were longer term and patients preferred them. Another meta-analysis looked at over a dozen studies from the perspective of researching whether ketogenic diets had advantages in terms of appetite control and satiety or satisfaction. They found that in most studies, participants reported significant decreases in hunger, both fasting and even a couple hours after meals, and increases in fullness and satisfaction compared to both baseline and to subjects following other diet protocols. In some cases, these changes in hunger and fullness were observed even within the 2-week adaptation period, which is kind of surprising. Uh, A couple of the other benefits, things that have been observed with ketone-based metabolism. We've already mentioned the anti-inflammatory properties of ketogenic diets, and this seems to result from the ketones and their metabolites acting as signaling molecules, as well as reducing the oxidative stress during the energetic production of ATP or adenosine triphosphate. Um, for example, there's PPAR gamma, which is peroxisome proliferator activated receptors. Those are transcription factors which control literally hundreds of genes that act on peripheral tissues, important regions of the brain, and other things. Hume, a researcher, and his colleagues recently noted a significant effect of circulating beta hydroxybutyrate on inhibiting other specific activators known as NLRP3s. Um, these details aren't important, but what's important is that the neuro and tissue protective effects of these, sometimes called inflammasomes and other activators, really suppresses inflammation and the action of things like cytokines. It limits the reactive oxygen species and it prevents cell death and or what's sometimes called apoptosis. So very important effects in the body. Another one of the commonly reported benefits of those on ketogenic diets for other reasons are improvements in mood and memory and cognition. Anxiety, tension, and fatigue also tend to be improved. In fact, I already mentioned my own experience, may have mentioned it, is already really positive in this regard. While specific studies in both humans and animals sometimes contradict each other on this point, there are several examples where improvements have been noted. For example, significant improvement in memory function among a group of 23 elderly folks following a ketogenic diet. Other studies, for example, by Brinkworth and some others, uh, found a pretty rapid improvement in mood over the first few weeks, but that low-fat diets, for example, maybe led to greater improvements over a year or 6 months. No difference in cognition. There's quite a bit of debate back and forth about this, but it's definitely clear that this is an area where additional research is needed. But if ketogenic diets can be associated with improved cognition or thought process, mood, decision making, especially when you're fatigued and stressed at the end of a long race. This could really have a profound impact on athletic performance. But as with so much, the impacts and effects are probably pretty highly individualized. So then, what might all this mean for endurance athletes? We've talked a lot about the medical benefits, but what benefits beyond improved body composition might there be? And is the improved glucose tolerance more than offset by the impact of the reduction of carbohydrates? Um, this is an area of intense ongoing debate among not only scientists and researchers, but also practically minded clinicians such as personal trainers, coaches, and others, as evidenced by a point counterpoint article recently published, actually earlier this month, in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. Um, as was true with the medically focused interventions, there's simply too much to talk about at all, too much published on this subject. But instead, I'll focus on the big picture and spend some time going deeper into some particularly relevant or timely studies. Um, the question is carbs required? Um, on the one side is the established sports medicine and dietetic community. This is exemplified in the joint statement on nutrition and performance issued by the American College of Sports Medicine, along with the American Dietetic Association and Dietitians of Canada. These guidelines really closely follow the overall standard recommendations discussed already. Quote, carbohydrates are important to maintain blood glucose levels during exercise and to replace muscle glycogen. Recommendations range from 6 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. savor the math, that's a lot of carbohydrates. The goal is maximizing reserves prior to training or competition, the continuous replacement of glycogen stores during an event to the extent possible, and really rapid replenishment afterward to aid in recovery. Um, the recommendations are typically 30 to 60 grams per hour, and they argue that these nutritional guidelines are especially important for endurance events lasting longer than an hour, just an hour. Um, on the other side are researchers and athletes themselves, like me, who've not only struggled with trying to comply with these recommendations, but actually have made ourselves sick as a result. And, I would challenge anybody to be able to go out for a run for an hour without having some carbohydrates. I think you hopefully can survive that. Um, and we found some great success with a low carb approach, and we've been pretty vocal and determined to share our stories and researchers to tell their story. However, before we get to them, let's take a look at the data on which these guidelines are based specifically for. So, what is the evidence? Are carbs really so essential before, during, or after training and racing? Um, I admit there's no shortage of studies showing a negative impact of carb withdrawal or restriction on performance. However, as nearly all of the proponents of ketogenic diets argue, virtually none of those studies have been conducted on athletes who are, in fact, keto adapted and have fully shifted into and established that new metabolic pathway. In other words, they're still carb dependent with high baseline insulin levels, and of course, they suffer short term impact as a result of that. Um, for example, in a recent review, they noted that this really began almost 70 years ago when Christensen and Hansen observed that high carb diets a week before an event um, really was correlated with improved performance. Um, then in the 1960s, the discovery that muscle glycogen was depleted in exercising muscle and that fatigue followed and could be moderated by carb intake really further supported this view. But nobody asked the essential question of were there other things that were impacting that as well? Um, the researchers tend today to suggest that these types of studies really resulted in a kind of confirmation bias, where the importance of carbohydrates are essentially taken for granted, and that competing hypotheses are rarely, if ever, even considered. As they and others, such as Tim Noakes, have pointed out, there's also really strong influence on the part of the sports drink and nutrition industry to support this view. In fact, the Gatorade Sports Science Institute is one of the most prolific funders of research into carbohydrate and electrolyte replenishment. This is a photo that I took last summer at the Olympic Oval during Ironman Lake Placid. For those that might not be able to see, that's a giant, maybe 40-foot high inflatable bottle of Gatorade. The question of whether this is a good choice for glycogen replenishment or even hydration for that matter, in my opinion, it's not, is open to debate. However, I will say I've seen an awful lot of nauseous and ill fellow competitors along the side of the road at these events. They were trying for their 30 to 60 grams of carbs per hour, but their stomach and intestines clearly had other ideas. To be sure, those that typically follow a high carb regimen will suffer when those inputs are restricted or taken away. Um, Not to mention the impact of the long term ingestion of high amounts of carbs and sugars and the resulting insulin surges necessary to deal with it. Um, Impacts the gastrointestinal system, the nervous system, and so on. So, really, is it any surprise that so many former athletes put on a lot of weight when they retire, or even when they take a hiatus due to injury or something like that? So, why do so many develop metabolic conditions, type 2 diabetes and heart disease later in life? Um, I think the question really remains, is there a better way? And if so, how does it affect performance? While there's a wealth of anecdotal and observational data on ketogenic adaptations in endurance sports, until recently there's not been a lot of research or attention paid to the early work on this subject. This has been combined with a renewed focus over the last few years on really well-designed, clinically controlled studies. Many are still underway, but initial reports are beginning to be published. The earliest well-designed research on keto adaptation and keto-adapted athletes was done by Stephen Phinney and his colleagues in 1983. The somewhat wordy title of their paper belied some fundamental keys. The first was the word chronic, in that they attempted to get their subjects keto adapted before conducting the test. Also importantly, they took submaximal exercise as their test. This really more closely resembles actual endurance exercise than does maximum effort or strength. Um, this was a small but highly controlled experiment. Following an initial week on a standard diet, each cyclist was put on a 4-week ketogenic diet with no more than 20 grams of carbs per day, supplemented with vitamins and minerals. A wide range of parameters were tested, including the blood, muscle tissue, and respiratory oxygen uptake before, during, and after a whole series of cycling tests that were at about 60 to 65% of maximum effort. Following a period of adaptation, these cyclists were not only able to maintain their former power output and endurance, but also demonstrated a remarkably enhanced ability to oxidize fat stores, while at the same time minimizing the utilization of both serum glucose and glycogen, which were reduced by a factor of 3 and 4-fold, respectively. In fact, fat use was virtually the sole fuel used at 64% effort in the 4th-week test. Um, Moreover, the glycogen utilized appeared to be derived primarily from slow twitch muscles, thereby preserving reserves in fast twitch muscles. This was really a study ahead of its time. A more recent study by Zajac and colleagues on off-road cyclists yielded similar results with a few important differences. This study had a slightly different design in that the same 8 subjects were tested following 4 weeks of either a mixed or a standard diet or a low-carb diet, as shown here. Their blood chemistry, and you could see the ratio here of 15% carb, 15% protein, and 70% fat in the diet that they used for low carb. Their blood chemistry was comprehensively tested, including hormones like insulin, cortisol, serum lipid profiles, glucose, beta hydroxybutyrate, free fatty acids. A whole lot of parameters were measured. Maximum and lactate threshold oxygen utilization, respiratory testing was done. Exchange ratios were measured. And the results, really, the resting levels of the beta hydroxybutyrate were 4 times higher after following that diet, and the free fatty acids were doubled. This led to an increased aerobic capacity and fat utilization during the moderate exercise test. They also had lower levels of creatine kinase, which creatinine kinase, I believe I spelled that wrong, and lactate dehydrogenase, which both suggested less muscle damage, improved body mass and composition, and only a slight impact on maximal threshold power. So really, very similar results to what Phinney and others saw, but with even more data and more to back that up. Finally, we get to a very recently published study that many people in the endurance community were anxiously and frankly somewhat impatiently waiting to see. This was a study by Jeff Volek and his students and colleagues, which was really the first to take a thorough look at elite, highly trained, competitive endurance athletes. This is the first in a planned series of studies, which goes by the acronym FASTER, which stands for Fat Adapted Substrate Use in Trained Elite Runners. So what they did was they brought together 20 elite competitors, 10 of which were who were adapted to a standard high carb diet, averaging around 60% carbs, 15% protein, and 25% fat, which is still moderate. But then another 10 who were on a low carb diet, 10% carbs, 20% protein, and 70% of their calories from fat. And they were adapted for an average of around 20 months, in some cases as long as 36 months or 3 years. Um, Building on their previous work, they did comprehensive testing, and it was performed multiple times over just a 2-day testing protocol. They didn't have to adapt these folks, they already were, but they did blood panels. They actually biopsied the muscle directly. They looked at VO2 thresholds, and then they followed that with a 3-hour treadmill test run at 65% maximum VO2. And the results were, again, pretty startling. For the low carb runners, beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketones and total ketone levels were 3 times as high during all phases, prior to, during, and after the testing. And they actually rose pretty significantly during the exercise and recovery, which really signaled that lipolysis, that the stored energy was being released as it was needed by the body. Peak fat oxidation during the run was 2.5 times as high. And this happened at a higher oxygen threshold. They were able to work harder and still burn more fat. There was a slight increase in glycogen utilization, which I'll talk about here in a minute, but they also probably use that as a substrate for some other things. And there was really no significant performance between the two groups. We just talk for a little bit about those average rates of fat oxidation. Were really pretty impressive. Even the lowest fat burners in the low carb group exceeded the highest fat burner in the high carb group. So there was really a distinct difference between how the two groups derive their energy. The authors noted that during exercise, the low carb group actually derived almost 90% of their energy from fat, while the high carb running group used a greater mix of fuel sources. Um, this is really important for endurance athletes because it strongly suggests that during long events, we may not need to take in any fuel from outside sources, and it may be really irrelevant if we can access those stored fat resources. So I guess so much for popping a gel every mile or two. They are sickeningly sweet to me anyway, but that's for others to decide, I guess. That surprisingly high utilization of muscle glycogen was also interesting. It was higher than we saw in the other studies of the cyclists, which suggests that maybe there's something about a longer duration of keto adaptation. Although the researchers really weren't able to determine exactly what was going on. They speculate, though, that this may either be a source of carbon for the production of a molecule called oxaloacetate to aid in the conversion of ketones to energy, or perhaps maintaining levels of glutathione, which is an important antioxidant. Certainly this is something that will be investigated in future research. There's obviously a lot yet to understand, but all of these results are consistent with the hypothesis that ketogenic diets and adaptations are certainly a viable and in some ways arguably superior option for endurance athletes. Before moving on, just mention very briefly what we've covered so far doesn't touch on a lot of the other studies that I didn't get to this evening, but ketogenic and low carb studies have been conducted on a wide range of other sports. In addition to cycling and running, there's cyclists, gymnasts, weightlifters, taekwondo, competitive walkers, and there's a mix of different diet compositions, study protocols, adaptations. If you're interested in any of these, I'd be happy to share the references as well. I also want to acknowledge that there are dissenting opinions in the sports physiology community, even right now. Several researchers continue to maintain that carbs are essential for athletic performance, and many argue that is true especially for endurance sports. Again, it's possible to critique these studies too in terms of time to adaptation and other parameters, which I do not believe invalidate the benefits of the ketogenic approach that have been introduced here. But that's the way science works. The best hypotheses are those that survive the most scrutiny and testing. And for what it's worth, my money's on the low carb side. I think ultimately it's going to be shown repeatedly that these benefits are real, and certainly a lot of people have been having success with it. So if you're interested, I'd be very happy to share these other references as well and invite a discussion. So what are the advantages of a ketogenic diet for endurance athletes? Different lists have been presented in the papers I've mentioned, but these I've kind of summarized and put together in my own comments here. The first is that access to abundant stores of energy, which are orders of magnitude higher than what's available in glycogen. But it's also really important fuel for longer events where gastrointestinal distress, the stress of running or biking, or the simple availability of food and drink makes ingesting, absorbing, and retaining calories difficult. But it also can help prevent, as I mentioned, the cognitive or physical impairment late in races. Keto adapted athletes are very unlikely to bonk in the latter stages of a race if you're carrying your fuel with you, basically. That fuel is more energy dense and burns cleaner. I've also already mentioned that every gram of fat contains more kilocalories of energy than does carbs. We've also talked about the decreased production of reactive oxygen species and the inhibition of pro-inflammatory agents. All of these provide distinct advantages, particularly to an athlete whose body can instead invest those really precious antioxidant reserves elsewhere, like working muscle. That definitely is a big help. The athlete can more easily control body composition and overall mass. This is an important element to optimizing power to weight ratios, for example, which are a key factor in cycling success. And they may also be critical in sports that separate competitors into weight categories like wrestling. An important factor that we haven't mentioned thus far is that ketogenic diets often also result in lower total body water as glycogen is used. An important factor for overall health are those decreased insulin levels and improved sensitivity, which again will help athletes prevent those chronic disease processes and the development of those over time. Puts a lot less stress on the body. Um, there's another issue which I didn't actually put on the list here, but I think might be important. And that is if you're accessing your stored body fat, it may help prevent the breakdown or catabolic breakdown of muscle for fuel during the latter stages of a race. This is an area I'm particularly interested in pursuing myself. I think it'd be interesting to know if serum markers of muscle damage, such as creatine kinase and others, are consistently lower in keto adapted athletes. In any case, supplemental resistance exercise, which we haven't really talked about too much thus far, has been shown to preserve lean muscle mass in even the most stringent low carb diets. Finally, the reduced oxidative stress and anti-inflammatory effects can surely aid in recovery. In fact, in my own experience, that is one of the most profound effects of being keto adapted. It seems that even after a really long, hard run, that recovery is not only faster but more complete. That said, it's important to remember too, rest is a part of training, not a break from it. You don't get faster or stronger when you run, bike, or anything else. You get faster and stronger when you recover. So let's now broaden our perspective back out a bit and talk about the effects, if any, of all of this in popular culture and media. Depending on your level of interest or existing knowledge base, there are a great number of really outstanding books on the market today. The Big Fat Surprise and Why We Get Fat are are very in-depth discussions of the history and background and politics and other things of the low-fat approach and how it is lacking, while the three on the right, the Atkins, the Keto Clarity, and the low-carb living, are all really excellent introductions for folks and more of a guideline on how to, if you will. This one in particular was my personal entree into the world of low-carb ketogenic sports nutrition. I've already mentioned both Stephen Phinney and Jeff Volek. They, along with Dr. Timothy Noakes, are essentially the founders of this area of research. There are others, Phil Maffetone, Dr. Eric Westman, but these are among the most prolific and effective researchers and proponents today. They are what got me started in it, and they and their students continue to contribute essential research and really foundational studies. This book is very highly recommended. There's also now some fantastic cookbooks, online recipes, and those kind of things. I'd be happy to share these references with you if you're interested. And speaking of which, there are some really terrific websites that are aimed at a non-athletic audience. The Ditch the Carbs, Real Meal Revolution is actually Timothy Noakes' website. He actually put it together with a few chefs and others as well. So there's an amazing amount of information there as well. And then Livin' La Vida Low Carb, Jimmy Moore's website, has podcasts and those kind of things. It's a bit of fun, and he also has some really great guests that he invites on as well. And if you want to lose a few hours, check out YouTube. But as with everything there, the quality definitely varies. Some of these sites do have a commercial aspect. They do try and sell you some things. But unless you venture into the scientific and academic literature, this information is pretty good. It doesn't necessarily delve into the specifics of the physiology or the metabolism or biochemical details, but they provide a really great starting point and a lot of helpful resources and references and recipes. There are debates, as always. Those that argue that carbs are evil and should be banished forever, and the devil himself created sugar. Those kind of debates get old after a while, but there's some really, really great information out there. You've also probably heard of very many famous athletes who follow some variation of a ketogenic or a similar diet that emphasizes healthy fats and moderate protein, abundant fruits and vegetables, while avoiding sugars and refined carbs. They include folks like professional cyclist David Zabriskie, Olympic gold and silver medalist, triathlete Simon Whitfield from Canada, professional basketball players Kobe Bryant and LeBron James, and Olympic champions like Lindsey Vonn and Paulo Ono. These are all folks who have talked a lot about their diets and how they change. There's also some other athletes who you might not have heard of, but might be particularly relevant to this discussion. There are many, many more, including some of the most prominent and elite endurance athletes in the world today. This is Tim Olson. He's a two-time winner and record holder at the Western States 100-mile race. And as you can see, that is not a flat race. It is grueling, and he is one of the foremost champions there. There's also Zach Bitter. He's the champion of several 50 and 100-mile races, and he actually holds the record for the U.S. 100-mile record, which he completed on a track in under 12 hours, 11 hours and 40 minutes to be exact. Just as a point of reference, that is 400 laps around your school running track in just over 700 minutes. That's 1 minute and 45 seconds per lap, or an average of 7-minute miles for 100 miles. So really an impressive accomplishment, and somebody who is very vocal about his diet being a key to his success. Some of the most current and as yet unpublished research is also around some adventure sports, things like mountaineering and mountain climbing. As you can see, these guys aren't uh, don't have a lot of room to carry food with them, so the more that they can optimize their nutrition using their stored body fat, the better off they're going to be. So a lot around alpine and mountaineering. And then really some of the most interesting research and much of it is unpublished, is sponsored by the military. Um, while the official Defense Department position is that ketogenic diets are unproven, um, there's potential, especially for special forces on extended missions without reliable access to food, the ability to maintain physical and mental stamina is a primary goal of this research. And a lot of this research is on using exogenous ketones. In other words, rather than getting your body to produce the ketones, actually ingesting them just in time, if you will, to temporarily induce ketosis, virtual life versus a lifestyle modification. There's extensive anecdotal evidence online that many military personnel are adopting low carb, high fat, both personally and professionally as well. So I just got done talking about all these abundant, high quality resources online and those sort of things. If those are available, why would you want to consult with a nutritionist like me? Here are a few reasons why I think you might consider that option. First is the personal experience with low carb, high fat, and ketogenic diets, and my own experience with endurance training and racing and work life balance and all of those kind of things. I've actually been there and done that. And while I may not be the fastest person, I certainly have longevity in terms of being out on the course for a long period of time and trying to keep going in a forward direction. So there is that. Also, there are many ways to implement and establish a ketogenic eating pattern. Traditional medical interventions begin with a supervised fast, which really rapidly drops insulin levels and kickstarts that oxidation of ketones. But that's pretty impractical and probably undesirable for an athlete in training, and is really unsustainable in any case. That's where some of a nutritionist's expertise can really come in handy, along with practical suggestions on what to eat, when to eat it, what quantities, and really how to sustain that over time and integrate it as part of a healthy lifestyle. Um, this also includes evaluating and optimizing your intake of key vitamins and minerals, as well as hydrating properly before, during, and after your training and racing. One of the things that people often overlook is the effect of a ketogenic approach on electrolytes, as an example, and the adjustment of hydration is also very important here. Another thing that nutritionists can bring to the table is support with planning and that implementation of change, which is really never easy, even when you're highly motivated and things are going well. You've heard of work-life balance. This is training and racing and work and personal life and nutrition and overall wellness balance. It's about identifying and planning how to best attain your personal body composition or athletic goals while remaining healthy, happy, and balanced in the least stressful and most sustainable way possible. Um, I've argued that in many ways, recreational and older age group athletes have it just as hard or even harder than professional athletes. Not in the sense of maybe losing money or your livelihood, but many of the pressures are similar. Our own expectations, our own dreams, as well as those of our family and friends. Um, but unlike pros, we don't have unlimited time to practice, to train, to recover. We often squeeze in a bit of training here or there, or get up well before dawn to run before work or get the kids off to school. It's not easy, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. I give everyone striving for any athletic or personal goal all possible respect. And you too deserve the help of a nutritionist as much as the pros or the Olympians. Um, a nutritionist, I can also help coordinate with your training regimen, your race plans, your medical team. As you can imagine, race day fueling and hydration strategies are critically important. And actually, executing and benefiting from them is even more important. The bottom line here is that it's not just about performance, but enhancing your overall health and well-being. My training and orientation is integrative and functional in order to help deal with the whole person, and in this case, the whole athlete. And I believe I can help. I've been there and would really love to do that. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great evening.